This story does not begin with barbed wire. It does not begin with gas chambers, trains, or camps, whose names would later become symbols of absolute evil. It begins much earlier, in words, charts, and quiet explanations. In Germany of the 1920s and early 1930s, murder was still illegal. Compassion was still taught. Most people still believed that killing another human being was a crime, a sin, or at the very least a moral failure. And yet, within little more than a decade, millions of ordinary people would accept, and in many cases participate in, the systematic destruction of their neighbors. Not because they suddenly became monsters, but because they were told something far more dangerous: that killing was not evil, that it was necessary, that it was, in fact, right. The transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, carefully, and with chilling logic. The language of hatred was replaced by the language of hygiene. Violence was reframed as prevention, and murder itself was recast as a form of duty. By the time the world learned the word Auschwitz, the moral groundwork had already been laid. The men who designed the system rarely spoke of hatred in public. Instead, they spoke of nature, science, and history. They claimed they were not acting out of rage or cruelty, but obedience. Obedience to laws older than religion, stronger than compassion, and more binding than conscience. At the center of this belief stood a single, devastating idea: that some people were dangerous not because of what they did, but because of what they were. This was not an accusation of faith. It was not a charge of crime. It was a verdict written into blood. Under this logic, a child could be guilty before learning to speak. A grandmother could be condemned without lifting a hand. Conversion, loyalty, patriotism, even military service, none of it mattered. What mattered was ancestry, grandparents, genealogy, a name written in a registry. This idea would soon be formalized into law in 1935 through the Nuremberg Laws, which defined Jewishness not by belief, but by descent. But long before ink touched paper, the concept had already taken root in the public imagination. Once people accepted that blood could carry guilt, the rest followed with terrifying ease. Courts were no longer needed. Trials became unnecessary. Mercy became irrational. If a person was declared a biological threat, then removing them was not murder. It was protection. If an entire group was labeled a disease, then extermination became treatment. This was the moment when morality collapsed, not in chaos, but in order. The architects of this worldview did not see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as guardians. Guardians of a nation, of a race, of a future they believed was under existential threat. They spoke of sacrifice, cleansing, and destiny. They invoked history, nature, and a vague, impersonal force often called providence, a God without commandments, without mercy, and without limits. In this belief system, compassion was weakness, doubt was betrayal, and killing, when done in the name of survival, became virtue. This is not the story of spontaneous hatred. It is the story of how an idea, repeated often enough, explained carefully enough, and wrapped in the language of inevitability, can convince ordinary people that murder is not only acceptable, but sacred. This is the story of the blood lie. And once it was believed, everything else became possible. In the early years of the Nazi movement, something curious happened to the language of belief in Germany. God did not disappear from public speeches. On the contrary, he was invoked often, sometimes passionately, sometimes solemnly. Yet the God being referenced no longer resembled the one preached from pulpits or described in Scripture. He had no commandments. He issued no prohibitions. And most importantly, he never said, "Thou shalt not kill." When Adolf Hitler spoke of God, he almost never meant a personal moral being concerned with mercy, justice, or the sanctity of human life. Instead, He referred to something far more abstract and far more dangerous: providence. Providence in Nazi rhetoric was not a loving creator. It was a force, an impersonal engine of history that rewarded strength and punished weakness, a cosmic justification for domination, conquest, and destruction. Where Christianity spoke of sin and redemption, Nazi ideology spoke of struggle and survival. Where religion emphasized moral restraint, the new belief system glorified inevitability. In Mein Kampf, written in 1924 during Hitler's imprisonment after the failed beer hall putsch, this worldview appears with unsettling clarity. Again and again, Hitler presents himself not as a man driven by hatred, but as an instrument of historical necessity. He claims that nature itself demands separation between races, that history progresses through conflict, that mercy toward the weak is not virtue, but sabotage. The stronger must dominate, he wrote, and not blend with the weaker, thus sacrificing his own greatness. This was not theology in any traditional sense. It was biological fatalism, dressed in the language of destiny. By the time Hitler became chancellor in January 1933, this idea had already seeped into the broader ideological bloodstream of the Nazi Party. God, as a source of moral law, was quietly being replaced by nature. And nature, according to Nazi doctrine, was cruel, selective, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. If nature kills without remorse, why shouldn't we? This question lay at the heart of the Nazi moral revolution. For centuries, even in times of war, European societies had operated under a basic moral assumption. Killing required justification. It might be defended as self-defense, punishment, or tragic necessity, but it was never morally neutral. There was always a sense, however fragile, that taking a human life crossed a line. The Nazi worldview erased that line. In its place stood a new hierarchy of value. Human worth was no longer inherent. It was conditional, dependent on race, heredity, and usefulness to the collective. Life was no longer sacred by default. It had to be earned. This is why traditional Christianity posed such a problem for the regime. Christianity insists on universal moral worth. It teaches that all humans are equal before God, that the weak deserve protection, and that power carries responsibility rather than privilege. It condemns murder not because it is inefficient or politically inconvenient, but because it violates a divine command. For the Nazis, this was intolerable. They did not attack Christianity head-on, at least not at first. Instead, they hollowed it out from within. Protestant churches were infiltrated by a movement known as the German Christians, who attempted to align Christian doctrine with Nazi racial ideology. Jesus was reimagined as an Aryan hero. The Old Testament was dismissed as a Jewish corruption. The cross itself was sometimes replaced with the swastika. The goal was not to abolish religion, but to neutralize its moral authority. Catholicism, with its loyalty to Rome and its independent hierarchy, proved harder to control. A concordat was signed with the Vatican in July 1933, guaranteeing religious freedom in exchange for political neutrality. In practice, the agreement was systematically violated. Catholic schools were closed, clergy were harassed, arrested, or silenced. Sermons were monitored. Moral dissent was treated as subversion. The message was clear. Faith was permitted only as long as it did not interfere with ideology. Behind closed doors, leading Nazis spoke with open contempt for Christianity. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, viewed it as a slave religion that glorified weakness. Joseph Goebbels dismissed its ethics as incompatible with the demands of a racial state. Hitler himself, in private conversations recorded by associates, referred to Christianity as a relic that would eventually be replaced by a more Germanic worldview. But again, this was not atheism. Atheism rejects the idea of higher meaning. Nazism did the opposite. It replaced one source of meaning with another. In this new belief system, the highest good was not righteousness, but preservation of the race. The highest evil was not sin, but degeneration. And the ultimate authority was neither God nor conscience, but history itself, imagined as a relentless force moving toward an inevitable racial reckoning. Under this logic, moral hesitation became a form of betrayal. Compassion was reframed as weakness. Pity was no longer humane. It was irresponsible. If the survival of the nation required cruelty, then cruelty became virtue. This belief was reinforced through education, propaganda, and ritual. Children were taught that nature eliminated the unfit. Adults were reminded that civilizations rose and fell according to biological laws. The individual was reduced to a cell within a larger organism, valuable only insofar as it contributed to the health of the whole. Once this framework was accepted, traditional morality no longer applied. Killing an enemy soldier in war was not enough. The concept of enemy expanded. It no longer referred only to those who fought back. It came to include those who allegedly weakened the nation from within, not through action, but through existence. This is where the idea of providence became essential. Providence allowed Nazis to claim that they were not choosing violence, but submitting to a higher necessity. They were not inventing cruelty. They were obeying nature's law. They were not committing crimes. They were fulfilling destiny. This psychological maneuver cannot be overstated. When people believe they are acting on behalf of something greater than themselves, God, history, survival, their sense of personal responsibility diminishes. Guilt becomes irrelevant. Doubt becomes treason. Moral reflection becomes indulgence. The question shifts from, is this right, to is this necessary? And necessity, once accepted as absolute, recognizes no limits. By the mid-1930s, this way of thinking had been fully normalized within the Nazi state. Speeches, textbooks, and official publications increasingly spoke of biological struggle rather than moral choice. The language of ethics faded. The language of inevitability took its place. It is crucial to understand that this process did not require mass hysteria or blind fanaticism. It relied on something far more common: rationalization. People were not told to hate, they were told to understand. They were not told to murder. They were told to protect. They were not told to abandon morality. They were told morality had evolved. Once morality was redefined as obedience to natural law, any action, no matter how brutal, could be framed as righteous. And when a society accepts a God without commandments, there is nothing left to stop it. This was the spiritual vacuum into which the next, far more lethal idea would enter. The idea that blood itself could carry guilt, and that some lives, by their very nature, did not deserve to exist. Every durable system of power eventually learns the same lesson. People obey laws, but they live for beliefs. By the early 1930s, the Nazi leadership understood that repression alone would never be enough. Germany was wounded, humiliated by defeat in World War I, crushed by hyperinflation, and polarized by political violence. Millions were desperate not just for stability, but for meaning. They did not want explanations alone. They wanted purpose. Nazism did not simply promise order. It promised belonging. This is where ideology crossed a crucial threshold. It stopped behaving like a political program and began to function like a religion, not in the sense of churches or prayer, but in the deeper sense of offering answers to the most dangerous questions. Who are we? Why are we suffering? Who is to blame? And what must be done? Traditional religions locate meaning beyond the state. They place moral limits on power. Nazism did the opposite. It sacralized the nation itself. The German people were no longer just citizens. They were a chosen biological community, bound together not by law or belief, but by blood. History was rewritten as a racial epic. Suffering was reframed as proof of destiny. Defeat became purification, and loyalty was elevated from civic duty to spiritual obligation. This transformation did not happen accidentally. Public rallies were carefully staged to resemble religious ceremonies. Torchlight processions replaced pilgrimages. Banners and symbols substituted for icons. Music, rhythm, and mass choreography produced a sense of transcendence, the individual dissolving into the collective. Participants often described these events not as political gatherings, but as revelations. The message was subtle but relentless. You are part of something eternal. You matter, not as an individual, but as a vessel of blood and history. Your life has meaning because the nation has meaning. Once this belief took hold, ordinary politics became almost irrelevant. Dissent was no longer disagreement. It was heresy. The leader occupied a unique position within this system. He was not merely a politician, nor even a dictator in the traditional sense. He was presented as an embodiment of the people's will, a figure whose authority flowed not from institutions, but from destiny itself. When Adolf Hitler spoke, he did not argue, he proclaimed. His speeches were less about policy than about revelation. He spoke of history, struggle, sacrifice, and mission. Again and again, he framed his rise not as ambition, but as inevitability. I believe today that I am acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator, he told the Reichstag in 1936. The language mattered. It implied submission, not choice. If the leader was an instrument of destiny, then opposing him meant opposing history itself. This belief structure solved a critical problem for the regime: moral anxiety. Killing, exclusion, and repression generate resistance, not only from victims, but from perpetrators. People hesitate, they doubt, they feel shame. A functioning moral framework produces friction. Nazism eliminated that friction by redefining virtue. Virtue was no longer compassion, it was loyalty. Virtue was no longer mercy, it was discipline. Virtue was no longer conscience, it was obedience. Nowhere was this transformation more complete than in the SS. Under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, the SS was conceived not simply as a security force, but as an order, a racial elite bound by ritual, genealogy, and belief. Himmler openly rejected Christian ethics. He viewed them as alien to what he imagined as ancient Germanic values. In their place, he cultivated a cult of ancestry, honor, and biological purity. SS members swore oaths not to a constitution, but to the leader personally. They underwent genealogical screening. Marriage required approval. Family life became a matter of state interest. Even death was ritualized, stripped of grief, and reframed as sacrifice. In this environment, ideology did not merely justify violence, it demanded it. To hesitate was not humane. It was weak. To question orders was not moral. It was treason. To feel pity was not noble. It was betrayal of the future. What made this system so effective was that it provided emotional rewards. People crave clarity. Moral ambiguity is exhausting. Nazism offered a world neatly divided into forces of life and forces of decay. Once labeled, individuals no longer needed to be understood. They only needed to be managed. The state did not ask its citizens to become sadists. It asked them to become believers. And belief, once internalized, performs a remarkable psychological trick. It transforms violence into service. Teachers became soldiers of education. Doctors became guardians of racial health. Bureaucrats became engineers of destiny. Each could claim they were not acting out of cruelty, but responsibility. The regime was careful to preserve this self-image. Euphemisms replaced blunt language. Deportations became resettlement. Murder became special treatment. Killing was hidden behind paperwork, schedules, and statistics. distance, insulated conscience. The result was a society in which millions participated in atrocity without ever seeing themselves as criminals. This was not mass insanity. It was moral outsourcing. When responsibility is transferred upward, to history, to nature, to destiny, individuals feel absolved. They become functionaries of something larger than themselves. The question, "Should I do this?" disappears. Only, "Is this required?" remains. And required it soon became. Once ideology had assumed the role of religion, it needed a central dogma, a foundational truth that could not be questioned. That truth would soon be defined, not in scripture or philosophy, but in biology. The idea that a people's fate was written in their blood, and that some blood carried not identity, but guilt. This belief would complete the transformation. Politics would become theology, administration would become ritual, and murder would become a sacred duty. The next chapter is where this belief takes its most lethal form, where metaphor hardens into classification, where prejudice becomes arithmetic, and where blood itself is declared a crime. The most dangerous lies are not the loudest. They are the ones that sound technical. By the mid-1930s, Nazi ideology no longer relied on slogans alone. It clothed itself in charts, measurements, and classifications. What had once been shouted at rallies was now printed in textbooks. Hatred was no longer emotional. It was administrative. At the center of this transformation stood a single word: blood. Not blood as biology, not blood as medicine, but blood as destiny. In Nazi thinking, blood was imagined as a carrier of invisible qualities: loyalty, creativity, morality, and even the capacity for civilization itself. It was not something a person had. It was something a person was. And once defined this way, it became permanent, unchangeable, and inheritable. This idea did not emerge in a vacuum. Germany, like much of Europe and the United States, had long been exposed to racial theories in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Social Darwinism, eugenics, and pseudo-anthropology were widely discussed, often cloaked in academic language. But where others debated, the Nazis weaponized. They took loose theories and turned them into absolute truths. They replaced probability with certainty, hypothesis with law. The architect of much of this thinking was Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi Party's chief racial philosopher and author of The Myth of the 20th Century, 1930. Rosenberg argued that history was not shaped by ideas or institutions, but by races locked in eternal struggle. According to him, culture itself flowed from blood. When blood was pure, civilization flourished. When it was mixed, decay followed. This worldview required an enemy, not an opponent, but a contaminant. The Jews were perfectly suited to this role. Unlike other minorities, Jews had lived across Europe for centuries without a single nation-state. They spoke different languages. They worked in varied professions. Many were secular. Many were religious. Some were deeply assimilated. Others were not. To Nazi ideologues, this complexity was not evidence of humanity. It was proof of deception. They argued that Jews were a race masquerading as a religion, a biological presence hiding behind belief, a parasite that infiltrated societies without visibly conquering them. The language was deliberate. Parasites do not have rights. Diseases are not negotiated with. They are removed. Once this metaphor took hold, the implications were immediate and devastating. If Jewishness was biological, then conversion was meaningless. If it was inherited, then children were threats. If it was permanent, then coexistence was impossible. This is where the idea of blood became indispensable. Unlike belief, blood could not be renounced. Unlike citizenship, it could not be revoked. Unlike behavior, it could not be corrected. Blood offered finality. The regime set out to define it with precision. In 1935, At the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg, the Reichstag passed a series of laws that formalized racial ideology into the legal structure of the state. Known collectively as the Nuremberg Laws, they stripped Jews of citizenship and prohibited marriage or sexual relations between Jews and Aryans. But the most important aspect of these laws was not what they forbade. It was how they defined. Jewishness was no longer determined by synagogue attendance or religious practice. It was determined by ancestry, specifically by grandparents. A person with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents was classified as a Jew. 2 made one a Mischling of the first degree. 1 made a Mischling of the second degree. This bureaucratic taxonomy transformed human identity into arithmetic. People who had never considered themselves Jewish suddenly found their lives reclassified. Veterans who had fought for Germany in World War I were expelled from professions. Civil servants were dismissed. Children were expelled from schools. Families were torn apart not by choice, but by genealogical charts. The cruelty of this system lay not in its chaos, but in its order. Forms were filled out, certificates were issued, clerks stamped documents. All of it looked legitimate, rational, even boring. And that was the point. The more impersonal the process became, the less it felt like persecution. Responsibility dissolved into procedure. To support this legal framework, the regime promoted a new class of experts. Racial scientists, anthropologists, and genealogists published manuals explaining how to identify Jewish blood. Nose shapes were measured, skull angles were compared, hair texture and eye color were cataloged. None of this had scientific validity. Even contemporary geneticists rejected the notion of discrete human races. Blood types did not correlate with ethnicity. Physical traits overlapped constantly. But Nazi racial science was never about discovery. It was about confirmation. The data was designed to reach a predetermined conclusion. One of the most influential figures in popularizing these ideas was Hans F. K. Gunther, whose books on racial classification sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Gunther presented himself as a neutral scholar, calmly explaining the facts of racial difference. His work was taught in schools. His diagrams were reproduced in newspapers. They made ideology look like education. What distinguished Nazi antisemitism from earlier forms was not intensity, but totality. Medieval Europe had persecuted Jews for religious reasons. Conversion, at least in theory, offered escape. Economic restrictions, ghettos, expulsions, all brutal but conditional. The Nazi system removed conditions. No act could redeem. No loyalty could compensate. No belief could absolve. A Jewish soldier who had lost a leg for Germany was still Jewish. A Jewish child who spoke only German was still Jewish. A Jewish grandmother who had not practiced Judaism in decades was still Jewish. The verdict was written backward in time. This is what made the concept of blood so lethal. It collapsed past, present, and future into a single, inescapable identity. It allowed the state to treat entire families as threats, not for what they had done, but for what they might one day become. Fear was projected forward. The regime claimed that Jews corrupted culture, undermined economies, and weakened nations from within. These accusations were rarely supported by evidence. But evidence was no longer required. Once blood became the explanation, causality became irrelevant. Economic crisis, Jewish blood. Cultural change, Jewish blood. Political dissent, Jewish blood. The logic was circular and therefore unbreakable. Propaganda reinforced this worldview relentlessly. Newspapers like Der Stürmer published grotesque caricatures portraying Jews as vermin, criminals, and sexual predators. Posters warned of racial contamination. Films depicted Jews as shadowy manipulators behind Germany's defeat in 1918. The goal was not to provoke rage, but to normalize disgust. Disgust is quieter than hatred. It does not shout, it recoils. and recoil justifies removal. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this system was its internal consistency. Once a person accepted the premise that blood carried danger, everything else followed logically. Laws became necessary. Separation became protective. Violence became preventative. At no point did the system require sadism. It required belief. Belief that society was a living organism. Belief that organisms could become sick. Belief that sickness had to be eliminated. Doctors were among the first to adopt this language. Public health campaigns blurred the line between medical hygiene and racial policy. Sterilization laws were passed in 1933, targeting those deemed genetically unfit. The same logic that justified these measures would later justify mass murder. Blood had become pathology. By the late 1930s, this worldview had permeated every level of German life. Marriage applications required proof of Aryan ancestry. Employment depended on racial status. Even private relationships were subject to scrutiny. Love itself became a political liability. The individual disappeared beneath the category. This was the moment when genocide became conceivable. Not yet inevitable, but thinkable. Once a society accepts that some people are biologically dangerous, the question is no longer whether they should be removed. It is only how. The next chapter is where theory hardens into law, and law prepares the ground for annihilation, where paper replaces conscience, and where classification becomes condemnation. Genocide does not begin with weapons, it begins with files. By the late 1930s, the Nazi state had completed a transformation more chilling than any act of open violence. It had converted ideology into routine administration. The language of blood no longer belonged only to philosophers and propagandists. It had entered offices, registries, schools, and courts. It was stamped, filed, and archived. Once this happened, killing no longer required hatred. It required compliance. The key to this transformation was law. The Nuremberg Laws of September 1935 were not dramatic proclamations shouted from balconies. They were written in careful legal language, debated in committee, and announced as measures to protect German blood and honor. Their tone was technical. Their intent was final. Citizenship was redefined. Jews were no longer Germans with fewer rights. They were subjects without political existence. Marriage and sexual relations between Jews and Aryans were criminalized under the law for the protection of German blood and honor. Violations were prosecuted not as moral transgressions, but as threats to public order. Most importantly, the laws did not ask who believed what. They asked who descended from whom. Identity became retrospective. A person's fate was decided not by actions, but by ancestry recorded decades earlier. Grandparents, long dead, often unknown, were suddenly decisive. Family trees became legal instruments. Baptismal records turned into evidence. Synagogue registries became state assets. This was the bureaucratic genius of the system. It outsourced guilt to the past. No accusation was needed. No trial was required. The verdict already existed, buried in archives. To function, the system required documentation. And so Germany produced documents. The Ahnenpass, the ancestry passport, became a central artifact of everyday life. It certified racial origin through genealogical proof. Employers demanded it. Universities required it. Marriage offices refused applications without it. Even participation in cultural organizations depended on its approval. People learned to fear paper. A missing certificate could cost a job. A misplaced record could end a career. An unverified grandmother could destroy a family. The machinery of exclusion did not rely on secret police alone. It depended on teachers, clerks, notaries, pastors, and doctors. Each performed a small task. Each followed procedure. Each could tell themselves they were not responsible for the outcome. This fragmentation of responsibility was essential. When harm is divided into steps, no one feels like the executioner. The system also provided psychological comfort. Bureaucracy feels neutral. It carries the illusion of fairness. Forms do not scream. Stamps do not bleed. Decisions appear to emerge from rules rather than choices. A clerk who stamped Jew on a document could claim he was merely recording a fact. A judge enforcing racial laws could insist he was upholding legality. A teacher excluding Jewish children could argue he was following policy. The moral weight dissolved into process. By 1938, this system had matured. Jews were systematically removed from professions. Doctors lost licenses. Lawyers were disbarred. Businesses were confiscated or forced into Aryanization, transferred to non-Jewish owners at a fraction of their value. Cultural life was purged. Public spaces became hostile. The Kristallnacht pogrom of November 9th to 10th, 1938, is often remembered for its violence. Synagogues burned, shops destroyed, thousands arrested. But its deeper significance lies elsewhere. Kristallnacht marked the moment when legal exclusion gave way to sanctioned terror, and the state faced no meaningful resistance. Police were ordered not to intervene. Firefighters were instructed to protect neighboring Aryan property, not Jewish buildings. Courts later punished Jewish victims for insurance claims. The message was unmistakable. The law no longer protected Jews. It managed them. After Kristallnacht, the remaining boundaries collapsed rapidly. Jews were forced to carry identity cards marked with a J. Names were changed by decree: Israel for men, Sarah for women. Public transportation was restricted. Curfews imposed, radios confiscated, pets banned. Even park benches became instruments of exclusion. Each measure seemed minor in isolation. Together, they formed a cage. What made this system so effective was its predictability. Violence is shocking. It can provoke resistance. Bureaucracy numbs. It conditions people to adapt, to comply, to wait for the next instruction. Many Jews believed, rationally, that survival depended on obedience. If they followed the rules, perhaps the worst could be avoided. If they filled out the forms correctly, perhaps they could endure. The state encouraged this belief. Orders were often contradictory. Deadlines shifted. Exceptions were hinted at. Hope was manipulated. Time was stretched. This was not chaos. It was control. By the time deportations began in earnest, after the outbreak of war in 1939, much of the work had already been done. Communities were isolated, assets seized, resistance exhausted, identity reduced to a mark on paper. Trains did not arrive in a vacuum. They arrived at the end of a paper trail. The transformation was complete. Murder no longer required rage, fear, or passion. It required coordination, schedules, lists, timetables. When people were finally killed, they were not executed as enemies. They were processed as categories. This was the triumph of the blood lie in its most practical form. An idea had become a law had become a routine, and routine was preparing the ground for annihilation. The next chapter is where bureaucracy gives way to ritual, where obedience becomes virtue, and where killing is no longer hidden behind paper, but celebrated as duty. There comes a point when an idea no longer needs explanation. It demands ritual. By the late 1930s, Nazi racial ideology had moved beyond theory and law. It had become something more intimate and more dangerous. A lived belief system, reinforced not just by orders, but by ceremonies, symbols, and daily practices. Nowhere was this transformation more complete than inside the SS. The SS was not designed to be merely an elite military or police force. It was conceived as an order, a self-contained moral universe with its own values, rights, and conception of virtue. Membership did not simply grant authority, it conferred meaning. To enter the SS was to enter a world where blood was sacred. Selection was the first ritual. Prospective members were required to prove Aryan ancestry, going back generations. Genealogical charts were scrutinized with obsessive care. A single Jewish ancestor, even several generations removed, could disqualify a candidate. This was not administrative necessity. It was symbolic purification. Blood had to be certified. Marriage became the next rite of passage. SS men could not marry without approval. Their fiancés were investigated, measured, classified. The state examined their bodies, family trees, and reproductive potential. Love was irrelevant. Desire was suspicious. What mattered was genetic value. A wedding, once approved, was no longer a private celebration. It was a racial act. Children born to SS families were not simply offspring. They were investments, proof that the future was being secured biologically. Large families were rewarded. Childlessness was discouraged. Parenthood was reframed as service. Within this system, killing did not stand apart from life. It belonged to the same moral logic. To create life was good, if the blood was right. To destroy life was also good, if the blood was wrong. Both were acts of protection. This is where the transformation becomes truly unsettling. The SS did not see itself as cruel. On the contrary, its members were encouraged to view themselves as disciplined, restrained, and even ethical. They believed that what they were doing was difficult but necessary, a burden placed upon them by history. They told themselves they were sacrificing their own humanity so that the nation might live. Ritual played a crucial role in sustaining this self-image. Oaths were sworn not to abstract principles, but to the leader personally. Ceremonies were conducted in spaces deliberately stripped of Christian symbolism. Death was honored not with mourning, but with solemn affirmation of purpose. Even language was ritualized. Killing was never described plainly. It was special treatment. Evacuation, resettlement. These terms functioned like liturgy, repeated until they lost their original meaning. Words insulated the conscience. The SS man was taught not to feel hatred. Hatred was emotional, uncontrolled, primitive. He was taught to feel duty. This distinction mattered. Hatred can burn out. Duty endures. When mass shootings began in Eastern Europe after the invasion of Poland in 1939 and the Soviet Union in 1941, SS units were instructed to carry out executions with discipline and order. Excessive cruelty was officially discouraged, not out of compassion for victims, but because it undermined the self-image of the perpetrators. They were not supposed to enjoy killing. They were supposed to endure it. Reports from these units reveal a chilling pattern. Commanders spoke of psychological strain, not moral conflict. The problem was not that killing innocent people was wrong. The problem was that it was exhausting. This concern led directly to the search for more efficient methods. Gas chambers were not invented because the regime suddenly became more brutal. They were developed because mass shooting was deemed too personal, too visible, too taxing for the executioners. Technology offered distance. Distance offered relief. Even here, the logic of ritual persisted. Victims were processed, categorized, scheduled. The act of killing was embedded in procedure, stripped of spontaneity. Death became industrial, predictable, repeatable, normalized. The SS framed this as progress. Inside the organization, killing was discussed as a task that required inner strength. Men who hesitated were not condemned as immoral, but as weak. Those who complied were praised not for cruelty, but for composure. The highest virtue was self-control. This inversion of morality reached its apex in the way perpetrators spoke about compassion. Sympathy for victims was considered dangerous, not because it might save lives, but because it might fracture belief. Compassion threatened clarity. And clarity was everything. The cult of blood depended on certainty. Doubt could not be allowed to spread. To question the premise that some lives were biologically dangerous was to threaten the entire structure. If blood was not destiny, then nothing justified what had already been done. By this stage, retreat was impossible. The system had crossed a moral event horizon. Men who had participated in killings could not easily return to a world governed by ordinary ethics. To do so would require acknowledging guilt, not just personal guilt, but collective crime. The ideology provided an escape. If killing was duty, then no guilt existed, only obedience. This is why the SS emphasized honor so relentlessly. Honor functioned as a substitute for conscience. It allowed men to see themselves as upright, even while committing atrocity. They were not murderers. They were guardians. The cult of blood did something else, equally important. It trained people to stop seeing individuals. Victims were rarely named. They were counted, tallied, reduced to units. When individuality disappears, empathy soon follows. Numbers do not suffer. Categories do not plead. Statistics do not die. By the early 1940s, this worldview was fully operational. Killing had been moralized, ritualized, and routinized. It no longer required justification. It required logistics. What began as metaphor had become mechanism. The blood lie was no longer debated. It was enforced. And once killing is framed as virtue, the final barrier collapses. The next chapter is where this system reaches its moral conclusion, where killing is no longer described as unfortunate necessity, but as moral achievement, where men stop asking whether they should kill and begin asking only how well they have done it. The final barrier to mass murder is not law. It is conscience. For years, the Nazi system had worked to erode that barrier carefully. God had been replaced by destiny. Morality had been replaced by biology. Law had been replaced by classification. Ritual had replaced reflection. By the early 1940s, the remaining obstacle was psychological. How to ensure that those who carried out killing did not see themselves as evil. The solution was not to suppress morality, but to invert it. In the moral universe the Nazis constructed, goodness was no longer defined by compassion or restraint. It was defined by effectiveness. Virtue was measured not by mercy, but by resolve. The question was no longer, is this right? But is this necessary? And soon enough, am I doing this properly? This inversion did not happen all at once. It emerged through repetition, reward, and social pressure. Those who hesitated were not condemned as immoral. They were labeled weak. Weakness was the only unforgivable sin. This distinction mattered. A person accused of cruelty might defend themselves by appealing to conscience. A person accused of weakness has nothing to appeal to, because weakness, by definition, disqualifies one from moral authority. The regime exploited this mercilessly. Executors were praised not for hatred, but for self-control. Orders emphasized calmness, discipline, and professionalism. Displays of emotion were discouraged. Excessive brutality was criticized not because it harmed victims, but because it reflected poorly on the image of the perpetrator. The ideal killer was not a sadist. He was an administrator. Reports from mass execution units in Eastern Europe reveal a chilling pattern. Officers complained not about guilt, but about fatigue. Not about the injustice of killing women and children, but about the psychological toll it took on their men. The problem, as they saw it, was efficiency, not morality. This framing mattered. Once killing is defined as work, ethical questions become management issues. The solution to moral discomfort is no longer reflection, but optimization. It was within this logic that industrialized murder emerged. Gas chambers were not introduced because the regime suddenly abandoned restraint. They were introduced because shooting was deemed too intimate, too visible, too destabilizing for those tasked with carrying it out. Technology offered distance. Distance offered relief. The victims disappeared behind walls, schedules, and procedures. The perpetrators disappeared behind roles. In this environment, language did the rest. Words like murder, killing, and death vanished from official communication. They were replaced by euphemisms: special treatment, processing, evacuation. These terms functioned like moral anesthetics. Repeated often enough, they dulled awareness. Language did not merely describe reality, it replaced it. The inversion was now complete. To feel horror was a liability. To suppress it was strength. To complete one's task without emotional disturbance was a mark of character. Those who performed efficiently were praised for their composure. Those who struggled were offered counseling, not to address guilt, but to restore functionality. In this way, conscience was reframed as a technical malfunction. The most disturbing aspect of this transformation was how ordinary it felt to those inside it. Men returned home from killing operations to write letters to their families. They worried about promotions. They complained about shortages. They discussed weather and logistics. The monstrous coexisted with the mundane, not as a contradiction, but as a routine. This was not because the perpetrators were uniquely cruel. It was because the system had taught them to separate action from meaning. Meaning had already been decided by ideology, by law, by destiny. Their role was not to judge, but to execute. This outsourcing of morality was crucial. Once individuals believe that ethical responsibility lies elsewhere, in history, in leadership, in necessity, their personal role shrinks to compliance. Obedience becomes virtue. Doubt becomes sabotage. The moral inversion reached its apex when killing was no longer framed as tragic necessity, but as achievement. Units were evaluated based on numbers. Efficiency was tracked. Promotions followed results. Success was measurable. And what can be measured can be optimized. At this stage, murder no longer required justification. It required performance. What had once demanded ideological explanation now ran on momentum. The machinery of death did not pause to ask whether its premises were sound. It only asked whether its output was sufficient. The system rewarded those who adapted fastest. Those who internalized the inversion most completely no longer experienced inner conflict. They did not feel themselves to be doing wrong. On the contrary, many believed they were carrying an unbearable burden on behalf of others. That belief, that they were sacrificing their own humanity so that society might survive, provided a powerful moral shield. They were not villains in their own minds. They were martyrs. This self-conception proved remarkably resilient. After the war, many perpetrators described themselves not as criminals, but as victims of circumstance. They spoke of orders, of duty, of necessity. They emphasized obedience. They minimized choice. And in doing so, they revealed the final success of the moral inversion. Even in retrospect, they struggled to recognize guilt. The system had trained them too well, by redefining virtue as obedience and compassion as weakness. Nazism accomplished something unprecedented. It created a moral framework in which atrocity could be committed not only without hatred, but without inner resistance. This was the true triumph of the blood lie. It did not require monsters. It required believers. Believers who no longer asked whether killing was wrong, only whether it was done correctly. The next chapter is where this inverted morality reaches its logical conclusion, where Auschwitz appears not as a rupture, but as an endpoint, where the machinery built from words, paper, and belief finally reveals what it was always designed to do. Auschwitz did not appear suddenly. It did not erupt out of madness, chaos, or uncontrollable hatred. It was not an accident of war, nor a descent into barbarism that caught an otherwise moral society by surprise. Auschwitz was the logical conclusion of a system that had already decided who mattered, and who did not. By the time the first gas chambers became operational in 1942, almost every moral decision had already been made. The victims had been defined. The perpetrators had been trained. The language had been sanitized. The paperwork had been perfected. What remained was execution. This is why it is misleading to treat Auschwitz as the beginning of the Holocaust. By the time people arrived there, the crime had already been committed. Not physically, but conceptually. The camp was not where dehumanization started. It was where dehumanization ended its journey. The road to Auschwitz was paved with ideas long before it was paved with tracks. First came the belief that morality was subordinate to nature. Then the belief that history demanded purification. Then the belief that blood could carry guilt. Then the belief that law could classify humanity. Then the belief that duty outweighed conscience. Auschwitz was simply where all of these beliefs met infrastructure. The camp itself was not designed primarily as a site of sadism. It was designed as a site of management. People were registered, sorted, assigned, processed. Selection took seconds. Life or death was decided with a gesture of the hand. The horror lay not only in the killing, but in the efficiency. Efficiency requires planning. Planning requires intention. Railway schedules were coordinated across occupied Europe. Deportation lists were compiled by local authorities. Timetables were synchronized so that transports arrived at regular intervals. The victims were told they were being resettled for labor. Many brought luggage. Some brought children's toys. None of this was improvised. The trains did not run because guards hated Jews. They ran because clerks filled out forms. The gas chambers did not function because soldiers were enraged. They functioned because engineers solved logistical problems. This distinction matters. If Auschwitz were merely the product of rage, it would be easier to dismiss as an aberration, something alien, something unrepeatable. But Auschwitz was built by people who believed they were being rational. They believed they were solving a problem. This belief was essential. Inside the Nazi worldview, Jews were no longer individuals. They were units of contamination, a biological threat quantified in numbers, not names. Once framed this way, mass murder did not feel like cruelty. It felt like sanitation. The language used by administrators reflects this mindset. Documents speak of throughput, capacity, and processing time. Human beings were discussed as inputs and outputs. Death was not dramatized. It was scheduled. This was the final triumph of the blood lie. It transformed genocide into an engineering challenge. By this stage, very few participants needed ideological instruction. The system ran on momentum. New personnel were trained not in hatred, but in procedure. They learned where to stand, what to say, which forms to sign. Moral questions were irrelevant. The answers had already been supplied years earlier. The victims, meanwhile, were stripped of every marker of individuality. Names were replaced by numbers. Hair was shaved. Clothing was confiscated. Families were separated. Even the dead were rendered anonymous, reduced to ash. This was not incidental. Individuality is dangerous to systems built on abstraction. A face can provoke empathy. A name can disrupt routine. Auschwitz eliminated both. What remained was pure function. It is important to understand that many of those involved never saw the entirety of the process. One person scheduled trains. Another guarded a platform. Another managed supplies. Another handled records. Each task was narrow. Each responsibility limited. No one needed to confront the whole. This fragmentation of knowledge was not a flaw. It was a design feature. It allowed participants to believe they were performing isolated duties rather than participating in a unified crime. The system did not ask for conviction from everyone. It required coordination. And coordination is easier to achieve than belief. By the time the scale of the killing became undeniable, retreat was impossible. Too many people were implicated. Too many careers depended on silence. Too many actions had already been taken. To stop would require acknowledging not just error, but evil. And evil, once normalized, is rarely named. This is why Auschwitz was not experienced by its architects as a moral collapse. It was experienced as grim necessity, as the culmination of a long process, as the fulfillment of a mission that had begun years earlier in classrooms, offices, and speeches. The camps did not create the blood lie. They proved it, in the most literal sense. They demonstrated what happens when a society accepts that some people are dangerous by nature, when identity becomes fate, when law replaces judgment, when duty replaces conscience. Auschwitz was not the failure of civilization. It was the success of a particular kind of civilization, one that valued order over morality, explanation over empathy, and belief over doubt. This is the most uncomfortable truth. The Holocaust did not require chaos. It required clarity. Clarity about who belonged. Clarity about who did not. Clarity about what had to be done. Once that clarity was achieved, everything else followed. Auschwitz was not the beginning. It was the end of a story that began the moment people accepted the idea that blood could determine worth. And once that idea is accepted, no amount of culture, education, or progress can protect a society from what comes next. The machinery will simply wait for permission. The final chapter remains, not about the past, but about what this story refuses to let us forget. The blood lie did not end in 1945. The camps were liberated. The regime collapsed. Trials were held. Documents were catalogued. Words like genocide and crimes against humanity entered the legal vocabulary of the world. History was written, taught, and commemorated. And yet, the idea at the heart of this story did not disappear, because it was never confined to uniforms or flags. It was never dependent on a single country or ideology. It required only one condition to survive: belief. The belief that some people are dangerous, not because of what they do, but because of what they are. The belief that morality is a luxury society cannot afford in times of crisis. The belief that violence becomes acceptable when it is explained well enough. The Nazis did not invent dehumanization. They perfected its administration. They demonstrated how easily language can anesthetize conscience, how quickly law can replace judgment, how efficiently compassion can be reframed as weakness, and how readily ordinary people can be persuaded to trade moral responsibility for belonging. This is the most unsettling lesson of all. The Holocaust was not driven primarily by rage. It was driven by reasoning. Reasoning that sounded scientific. Reasoning that sounded responsible. Reasoning that promised order, safety, and a future free of uncertainty. Once people accepted that blood carried guilt, everything else became negotiable. Rights, lives, even children. Once killing was framed as prevention, resistance appeared irrational. Once obedience was defined as virtue, dissent became immoral. The blood lie did not need hatred. Hatred is unstable. It burns hot and burns out. The blood lie needed something far more durable: certainty. Certainty that the world could be divided cleanly. Certainty that complexity was weakness. Certainty that some lives mattered more than others. That certainty is seductive. It always has been. It appears in times of fear and instability. It promises clarity where reality offers ambiguity. It reassures people that suffering has a cause, and that the cause has a face. History shows us, again and again, where this path leads. Not always to camps, not always to gas chambers, but always to the same first step. The moment when language stops describing people and starts classifying them. When neighbors become categories. When statistics replace stories. When explanations replace empathy. Genocide does not begin with killing. It begins with permission. Permission to think of others as problems to be solved. Permission to trade conscience for comfort. Permission to believe that morality must yield to necessity. The blood lie is dangerous, precisely because it feels rational. It wears the mask of responsibility. It speaks in calm voices. It arrives with charts, policies, and assurances that this time, violence is regrettable but required. That is why remembrance is not enough. What matters is recognition. Recognition of the language that precedes exclusion. Recognition of the arguments that precede violence. Recognition of the moment when duty is allowed to outrank humanity. The story you have just read is not a warning about the past. It is a warning about a pattern. One that does not announce itself with screams or sirens. One that arrives quietly, in explanations, in classifications, in promises of safety. The blood lie never needed monsters. It only ever needed believers. And belief, once surrendered, is far harder to reclaim than freedom.